Gonna work it all for me? We will find out. Alexa, stop. There we go. We're gonna call this playtest 1. Save. There we go. Okay, this seems to be good-ish, relatively speaking. Let me see if I can find the actual data for this. If I click on that, where am I getting the actual URL? Not being very helpful. There we go. Okay, there we go. That should be a little bit more helpful. Okay, let's see how we do here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the new materials here, and I'm actually gonna switch this over so we can look at that. We'll use some anime archaeology stuff here. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, no, that's fine. And just 1 second while we switch some things around, and I'll see what I can talk about here. That should work. That should work pretty well. We'll just change the title there. This is kind of interesting. Alright, and I think we can put that, and cool. Alright, so here we go. So we have this new One D&D thing, which is kind of exciting, but also kind of weird, right? We have this whole new thing potentially with D&D. So let's see what we've got. I'm going to see what I can do to minimize all of this. Forgot how to do all the settings. There we go. Get it fairly large. So what do we got? This is apparently the new playtest for the next edition of D&D, basically 6th edition. They're calling it One D&D. And so let's look at it. I think the most useful way of doing that is start at the beginning. The document is the first in the series. It presents material designed for the player's handbook coming out in 2024. Using rules from the player's handbook except where noted. So basically you can use the 2014 original 5th edition player's handbook as the basis. This is kind of overriding all of that. What this includes are character races, character backgrounds. So splitting those two things out more explicitly. Starting languages, which I think is probably one of the most important things, most interesting things in this particular thing. We've got feats, which, I'll admit I've never particularly loved feats. Feats have been something that I've had problems with in the past in D&D. So we'll see what they do with feats. And then a rules glossary. So basically, what are some updated terms for this new edition or new revision of the game? And they make a big deal about how this is all playtest material. And I get it. A lot of people tend to take this material as gospel. That, oh my gosh, this is exactly how the new D&D will be. And that's not correct. This is a draft. It is an attempt to figure out what that's going to look like. But this is not what it's actually going to look like. And that's fine. So. Interestingly, it says determining your origin. After choosing your character's class, it's time to consider the character's origin, ancestors, etc. So what we've got here in this document is not the first thing you'll do when creating a character in the next D&D. This is kind of the second step. So class will still be what's assumed to be your first choice. Then you'll choose these other elements, your race, your background, and your language. Now, background was kind of a separate thing in 5th edition. It was a fairly secondary element to your character, and it looks like they're really foregrounding it here for this, which is interesting, and we'll see what exactly that looks like. And then again, a language, and again, I think this is going to be a really interesting element of the game. A race represents ancestry and confirms game traits to the character. Now, this is notable because classically, or not even classically, recently, D&D came under some fire for the idea that races were racist, so to speak. That the fact that a race, a racial origin like orc, gave you numerical advantages or disadvantages felt racist. It felt like it was unnecessarily limiting players who want to play a particular race and implying things about that race. So what's interesting here, some people were assuming that race would simply be cosmetic. It would affect your physical appearance, but nothing else. But no, there will be actual game traits in race. A background is a collection of characteristics that represent the place and occupation that are most formative for the character. The character origin overview table is the traits your character gains from race and background. And here are those traits. So what's interesting here is they're splitting this out to say, okay, you have your race, you have your class, you have your background, and here are the components of each of those. So a race and or a background can affect these various things. In other words, your race will affect your creature type, your size, your speed, while your background will affect ability score, skill proficiencies, tool proficiencies, etc. Okay. So your race tells you what creature type you are. Also interesting because traditionally races have always been humanoid for, at least for the starting races, for player characters. Size, also interesting because traditionally player characters have been medium, and one of the reasons there is that there are a lot of surprising advantages and disadvantages to not being medium size in the game. If you are large, you can't fit through doors. Then, like, doors fit for medium-sized creatures. There's a lot of exploring you can't do because you can't physically fit in a lot of the maps available in the game. For example, you just can't go down that hallway. And whereas if you're small, you have some dexterity advantages that can be really useful in certain places, kind of outsized compared to other options. Speed, typical. Lifespan, again, typical. Although I've never found lifespan to be a particularly useful thing in character creation. Like, it's an interesting detail, but it rarely comes up in game. And then special traits. Background traits, here's where your ability score bonuses are. As is typical for 5th edition, ability scores only go up. I believe that's true. Here's my copy of the original Player's Handbook from 2014. See here. Yeah, and race came first back then. Race and then class. It's kind of interesting. You got simply ability score increases, no ability score decreases. And typically, if you had a race with sub-races, so like elves versus drow, elf would give you a 2-point ability increase, and then your kind of sub-race would give you a 1-point ability score increase somewhere else. You got ability score bonuses, skill proficiencies, tool proficiency, a language. Again, I think this is really interesting. And then 1 first level feat plus equipment. I do like the foregrounding of backgrounds, so to speak. I do like the idea of saying, okay, class is kind of the keystone element of your character. It's your class is what defines your character more than most other choices in the game. Really, any other choice in the game. When people describe their character, fighter, cleric, etc., is a word that they, it's something they always include in their character description. They rarely forget that. They might forget that they are a an elf or whatever, but they'll pretty much always say if they're a fighter or a wizard or what have you. Making the background more central to it allows you to combine these things to say, especially with, with your class, race, background, it says, okay, your class is kind of what you do, your race is what you were born with, and your background kind of connects those two things, right? You started off with your race, you are now at your class, fighter, but then what got you to fighter? Were you a soldier who now has that kind of class of fighter, or were you a sailor with a lot of rough and tumble, work out on the boat, and then maybe got in fist fights a lot on shore, whatever, and so now you kind of end up as a fighter. All these things kind of make sense. So I do like this split of elements. And then you have your character race. I like this sidebar about children of different humanoid kinds. The idea that you can have children of various races. And particularly this is thanks to the magical workings of the multiverse. In other words, you don't have to worry too much about how this is biologically possible. If you have magical beings, they can procreate in whatever kind of way you want to imagine that. Thanks, Jeremy. Good to see you here in the chat. Feel free to ask any questions as we go through this, because I'm still just kind of absorbing all of this myself. So you have all these various options, and then they actually give you rules for doing this. You're going to play a child of two disparate races. You choose two race options that are humanoid to represent your parents. In other words, you have to have two biologically relatively similar races. So two humanoid parents. And then what you do is you determine which of those race options provide your game traits, size, speed, and special traits. And then you can mix and match visual characteristics as much as you want. So basically, one parent will dominate. You will have orc traits, orc mechanics, orc gameplay mechanics, or elf gameplay mechanics, but then your physical appearance can be kind of whatever you want from those two sides, which I think you could argue that another way of doing this would be to say you can kind of mix and match and choose between the two, but then that quickly turns into weird power gaming where you're kind of choosing the best of two. This simplifies things. This says one or the other is the dominant, you choose that one, but then that doesn't have to be the only defining thing about your parents. You can have your mother's eyes, your father's eyes, whatever, or neither, because of how genetics work. And so I do think that is an effective simplification, especially in the character creation process. And there are so many choices in character creation. I think you can really go down a rabbit hole if you're a child of those two things. You can just choose one set of mechanics. I like that a lot. And again, it's a game that you can evolve as much as you want. So humans. Humans are as varied as they are numerous. They are skilled pioneers and artisans. They're builders of nations, roads, cities, and ships. They try to secure their place in the world. Humans are as diverse in appearance as people of the earth and have many gods. It is said that they were originated in Sigil. So very early on in this game, we are established, or in this playtest material, we are establishing some place names. Sigil exists in the core game rules. Again, in playtest. I like that. I like the fact that you're kind of pulling in world details in there. Good question. I have been playing D&D since, let me pop out a thing and look it up, because I actually have a little place. I have a little website where I stored a bunch of this stuff. Hopefully it still works. There it is. So, I've been running D&D since 2006. Back in 3rd edition. So that's, wow, 15 years or so. And DMing for that entire time. So I started as a DM because we all wanted to play D&D. No one wanted to DM, and so I volunteered. And so I've almost always DM'd. I have very rarely played the game for a lot of different reasons. I've run since 3rd edition. I've also played 1st edition in the past, which is also kind of 2nd edition. 2nd edition is just kind of expansion of 1st edition, which is probably what they're basically doing with this. I think 6th edition is going to be to 5th edition what 2nd edition was to 1st, meaning that 2nd edition was an expansion and consolidation and cleanup of 1st edition rules, which had grown dramatically, but was still mechanically compatible with 1st edition. So basically, 1st edition came out, and there were lots of extra articles and materials published for 5th edition, 1st edition with more rules, etc., etc. And then eventually it got so big, although there are other things going on as well, that they decided to turn that into 2nd edition and do a revised all-in-one kind of explanation of that in 2nd edition. So it sounds like that's what 6th edition is. Thank you, Charmy. I appreciate that. So what's interesting too here is in the 5th edition player's handbook, humans are described, I think, primarily as, let's see here, they did this weird thing where they didn't quite go alphabetical, which I always found annoying. Humans are the youngest of the common races, late to arrive in the world scene. Humans are more physically diverse than other common races. They're a typical human. Humans are the most adaptable and ambitious people among the common races. Widely varying tastes, morals, and customs. So this is fairly similar, in fairness. They are varied, relatively short-lived. Interesting calling them skilled pioneers and artisans, builders of nation, roads, cities, and ships. This would be a more typically gnomish trait of being, builders. Although builders of nations and roads and cities, as distinct from, say, dwarves, who build certainly cities, more underground cities. I like that distinction. It kind of makes sense. And they like to create art, amassing wealth, making laws, and questing for immortality, to secure their place in the world in the annals of history. That's interesting to me. The idea that humans have ambition. Hey, Lord Adma. Humans have ambition. They want to make a mark on history in a way that is not as common in other races. That does track for me as well. You think of elves. They're more long-lived. They're more, they're more thinking very long-term. Yes, they want to make their mark, but they're not as concerned about being the person written down in history. Dwarves kind of all work together. I like that. And of course, diverse. Human traits. They are humanoid. Makes sense. Size. This is interesting. About 4 to 7 feet tall. When I'm writing game rules, I like to be more specific than this, and I will just say 4 to 7 feet tall instead of about, because that says, well, can they be 3.9 feet tall or 7.2 feet tall? Why the about when it could just be 4 to 7 feet tall? So I'm assuming this means we're leaving our options open. This is playtest material. We're still just being sort of general and broad about this. But also note they can be medium or small. So right off the bat, humans are not always medium. They can also be small. That's kind of shocking. I wonder if this is to accommodate child player characters or just generally like young teen player characters. The idea that you can be, younger and play D&D and still be human, or that just you can have small humans. I suppose this could also be, you could be a little person, right? So that could just be what they're talking about there. Makes sense. Chosen when you select a race. Yeah, you can't just... Okay, so there we go. Actually, when it says chosen when you select this race, that's what they must mean. That they're talking about like little people. This is not being a child going into an adult. This is like, this is who you are. Okay, fair enough. Speed 30 feet. Lifespan, you can find it fine. And you have these special traits. Resourceful. You gain inspiration whenever you finish a long rest. Holy smokes. You have inspiration once a day. Which based on how people play D&D, is basically constantly. Inspiration gives you advantage on a D20 roll, basically. That's pretty powerful. Proficiency in an extra skill, good. And then you get these skill feat or another first level feat of your choice. Fine. We'll see how feats work out. In the Forgotten Realms, for example. So this also tells us that the next edition is going to be multiversal from the start, or at least again in the playtest, they're like, here are the multiple worlds of D&D, and we're going to support a variety of worlds instead of saying we're kind of focusing on the Forgotten Realms. I don't know if that's going to work out or not. That can be overwhelming to people to realize there are multiple universes I could set my game in, but that seems to be where they're going there. And then humans bring elements of their cultures with them, giving rise to diverse settlements. So again, diversity. And you have Ardlings. Hello. Supernatural beings who are either born in the upper planes or one or more ancestors who originated there. Their bright souls shine with the light of immortal beings who call the upper planes home. So basically, I'm assuming these are angelic creatures. They have a head resembling that of an animal, typically one of virtuous associations. Oh, okay. So this is like Aarakocra. Similar thing. So they're kind of, going wider with the idea like Aarakocra and similar races, with a specific celestial thing. Is this normally what a playtest is, though? It seems like it's a design document without any call for feedback. There is a call for feedback. It is, I don't know if it's in the document itself, but on D&D Beyond, when you go to download this document, it says in there, we will ask for feedback later. We want you to absorb this first. And that is pretty typical for a playtest. Especially if the playtest is expecting you to play it. You don't get the survey for that playtest when you first are given the document. You play it first and then are given the survey, right? The survey comes at the end of the playtest period. So this is not uncommon. Now, if they basically said, we're going to release this in June of 2024, and we'll ask for feedback in May of 2024, that would be a really odd playtest. But I'm assuming because that time frame is not that's how that's going to work. And also, given the fact that this is just one piece of the playtest, I think that's fine. I think they're saying, here, absorb this, go for it. This is not the entire game, and we'll ask for feedback later. This is piece one, and then we'll probably, release other pieces and have other feedback windows as time goes on. But yeah, again, this is not shocking to me as a longtime gamer. Arlings gains magical power from that ancestry, and they can manifest spectral wings. Ooh, so like a Tengu. That's cool. Their moral and ethical outlook is self-determined, however, not fixed by ancestry. Okay. You can be exalted, heavenly, or idyllic. And we've got Mount Celestia, we've got Arcadia, Bitopia, Isgard or Borea, Beastlands, Elysium. Okay. And then Ardling traits, humanoid, medium or small, speed, lifespan, and the special traits of angelic flight. So you can spout spectral wings for a moment and fly up to a number of feet equal to your speed. You can use a bonus action, you can do proficiency bonus per long rest. So a few times per long rest. Fair enough. That's reasonable. And then we have here some examples. If you're exalted, you might have a cat, eagle, goat, or mule, animal type, so forth and so on. Interestingly, that heavenly has pig. I'm assuming that's that might be a Journey to the West reference, Chinese reference. I don't know. Celestial Legacy. You get various. You get a basic bonus cantrip for being from a particular legacy. Fair enough. Again, not shocking. And then other spells as you level up. Fair enough. Arlings of Many Worlds. So this of many worlds section fascinates me. the idea that we give you all the mechanic stuff, and then we talk about kind of all the various parts of the world, of the many worlds that they can be part of. I'll be honest, I'm not crazy about this. Now, again, this is playtest material, so this could be some kind of an FYI thing. This probably will not be, this might not be, in this place in the final product. This might just be one of those things where they're like, we're giving you lots of context in the playtest material, and we'll see how it all fits together once we kind of have everyone's feedback. But this idea of kind of saying, here's how this race fits into the overall world. Again, it feels a little overwhelming. It feels like a lot to think about when you're first creating your character, but it could be useful. Right? Yeah, a lot of modifiers. A lot of modifiers here. Now, they have talked about how D&D Beyond and the D&D Digital Experience, I think they're calling it, are going to be pretty tightly integrated into this. So, presumably, they can be a little heavier on the modifiers here, because they're assuming you'll have digital tools to manage all of that, whether at the table or at least to kind of pre-calculate all this kind of stuff in your character sheet. So you will not have to kind of, run all the numbers during the game. You can at least have your character sheet loaded in D&D Beyond or whatever. And again, if you print that out and bring it to the game, fine, but you got all of this stuff kind of already built out digitally. You have Dragonborn. And again, this is kind of weird. One story holds these eggs were blessed by the dragon gods Bahamut and Tiamat. This all feels like this would be great for the Dragonborn of the Many Worlds section. Like, I don't understand why we're giving all of this information about origins and so forth in this opening when I would be more interested in what do they look like, what can they do, and then give me background elsewhere. But that's just me. Traits, humanoid, always medium. That's interesting. Cannot have short Dragonborn. Lifespan, again, I've never found lifespan to be particularly relevant in my games. Right? Like, okay, you're a Dragonborn, you live about as long as a human, okay? It can have an effect. It's useful kind of as lore for those players who can play that effectively, but, 99 times out of 100 during the game, it just isn't really relevant. So, again, this seems like the kind of thing that I would not put it as a significant character trait. No large Dragonborn either. You've not seen a large player character yet. Draconic ancestry. So you have thing, and this is a thing from 5th edition. If you are born of black dragons, then you can do acid breath. If you are born of brass dragons, you can do fire breath, so forth and so on. What's also interesting here, though, is this is a mixture of metallic and chromatic dragons. So you could be from a black dragon or from a bronze dragon. Cool. And so you can do that breath weapon. Looks like we've got some pretty similar mechanics to 5th edition. Now, as they said in the playtest, this is meant to be backwards compatible with 5th edition. So you'll be able to play Curse of Strahd with these game rules, presumably. But yeah, this looks very, very similar to a 5th edition attack and damage combo there. Damage resistance to that damage from the Draconic Ancestry trait. You have Dark Vision, as does practically everyone. I may go back and see how many characters have Dark Vision, because in 5th edition, kind of everything had Dark Vision. And then you instinctively know Draconic. Cool. And then we have this Dragonborn of Many Worlds. On some worlds, they're built near dragon layers, and these ancient systems still exist. So Argonessin from Eberron. Here we go. So yeah, we now see very clearly a commitment to many different game worlds in the playtest materials. Again, that might not last, but on other worlds, they apply their skills, and some ones popular mostly on Dragonborn. Again, here's my problem with this. I read all of this, and what I don't get a sense of what my Dragonborn is. I get a sense of some of the things my Dragonborn could be. So, yeah, mystical bond to the material plane are spread across as many worlds. Okay, so at least I know I'm not going to be unheard of in most in most worlds. But this has many worlds, not most worlds, so it depends. But basically, if my world has Dragonborn, I expect them to be fairly common. On some worlds, the earliest Dragonborn settlements were built near dragon layers. Many of these still exist. So like in Argonessen, with Dragonborn cities tucked among its mountain ranges. In other worlds, they apply their skills in non-Dragonborn settlements, fulfilling an urge to expand their presence and influence much as dragons do. So I read that and I think, okay, but are those things on my world? Are those dragon layers on my world or not? Do I live in those settlements or not? This just doesn't feel like it gives me really compelling choices for my characters. I would rather this say, in many places, Dragonborn cities are tucked among its mountain ranges, where they were built near the dragons that the Dragonborn were near to pay tribute to their progenitors. You know, that's an option right there. In other places where Dragonborn are less common, they live in mostly non-Dragonborn populations, etc. Like, be more specific about, you're either going to see them in settlements, you're going to see them over there, and then say, if you want to do something different, that's fine, but here are some more directive choices around Dragonborn. That's what I'd like to see here more. And that'd be good feedback for them. Again, and this is a draft. Like, I'm not complaining about this to be clear. This is exactly what this playtest is meant to be, is to say, hey, here's some ideas, let's throw them out there, see what folks think about them. They're not wrong to write all of this. It's kind of coming out of their head, and so now we can kind of do that. Dwarves, blah, 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 blah. We get some background on those. Dwarf traits, humanoid, medium. Interesting that dwarves cannot be small. I would expect there to, of all the races, except maybe halflings, I would expect dwarves to be able to be small. It's interesting they're always medium. Dark vision, of course. Resilience, resistant to poison damage. Toughness, hit point maximum increases by 1. Once you get beyond the first few levels, an extra hit point is not remarkable. Forge-wise, you gain tool proficiency with jeweler's tools. Okay. And then stone cutting. Cool, pretty typical. And then dwarves of many worlds. Okay. Elf. Yeah, no large dwarves either. Okay, so we have a pretty good idea about this. Let's just skim back through. Elves also have dark vision, elven lineage, so similar to the others, you're going to be drow, high elf, wood elf. That gives you extra spells. Fey ancestry, hard to be charmed, basically, and you trance. So, pretty typical. Elves many worlds. Gnomes, always small. Fair enough. Dark vision, gnomish lineage, very traditional. This is interesting. We have, okay, yeah, pretty typical. Gnomes of many worlds, forest gnomes, rock gnomes. Halflings. And many halflings have a brave and adventurous spirit that leads on a journey to discovery. So, Bilbo and Frodo. More Bilbo. Thinking out of tight spaces. So yeah, they're leaning pretty hard into the Bilbo inspiration for halflings here. Buck of the halflings. Yep. Okay. Always small, makes sense. Advantage on saving throws to avoid or end being frightened. Nimbleness, luck. You can re-roll a 1 on a d20, but you must use a new roll. Note the use of d20 tests. This is a new term in this rule set, which we'll get to later. They're kind of rebranding and reworking the whole d20 roll into a specific term, which I do like. Proficiency in stealth, and then various versions of halflings. But again, I think this is a little too vague. I think saying some places they're like this, some places they're like this. I would prefer to be just more directive. Orcs, okay. probably the most controversial race in D&D. So let's look at this. Orcs trace their creation to Grumsh, the one-eyed god, an unstoppable warrior and powerful leader. Armed as children with certain gifts to help them thrive on worlds beset by monsters. So that's interesting. So orcs are strong and warrior-like to fight monsters. Even when they turn their devotion to other gods, they retain the gifts that the god bestowed upon them, might enter into divination, the ability to see in the dark. Orcs are on average tall and broad, gray skin, small ears. Young orcs are often told by their ancestors' ancient conflicts with elves in forests, dwarves under mountains, and invaders from evil planes of existence. Inspired by these tales, they often wonder when Goomps will call on them to match the heroic deeds of their ancestors, if they will prove worthy of the one-eyed god's grace. So, still retaining the idea that the orcs have a long-standing grudge against the traditional humanoid races, particularly elves and dwarves, but also Cthulhu. This is interesting. I do kind of like this. I like the idea of shifting orcs to say, you're placed on these worlds with all these horrible monsters, and so you are created to be kind of this warrior race, this tough race. But because just the world sucks. The world's hard. Fair enough. And then there are these historical stories handed down generation by generation about, oh yeah, we fought the elves, we fought the dwarves, which undoubtedly happened. There are any number of reasons why that could happen, though. So it leaves a lot of space open for the DM to interpret that in their games and in their game world, to say, okay, what did that conflict look like? Was that because the orcs were invading elven lands? Was it because the elves just didn't like orcs? Was it because, there was some inherent conflict between dwarves and orcs? Was it political? Was it any number of things? That's kind of cool. It gives the DM a lot of flexibility to tell the orcs, to position the orcs within their world. To your point, Lord Admira, orcs for a long time have been kind of the simple brutish enemy in D&D. The brutes that just go out there and they're savage and you whack them until they're dead. And this allows them to still be that. If your game world needs a simple, monstrous enemy, they can be that. But they can also just be these powerful warrior-like humanoids. Not even warrior-like, but these powerful, strong, enduring, determined humanoids, which can fill lots of roles. So I do think this works nicely. Again, it doesn't. I think it doesn't destroy any of the niches that orcs can fill in a game world, but it gives you a lot of options for them to fill various things. Again, they can still be kind of sort of demons. In Tolkien, orcs were very much this, debased, demonic race. Not demonic in the sense of literally heaven and hell. And they can certainly be that with this introduction, but they don't have to be. That's fine. Always medium, no small orcs, no large orcs. Adrenaline Rush. You can take the dash action as a bonus action and gain number of temporary hit points equal to your proficiency bonus. Cool. So you have a charge. Charge across things. Dark vision, powerful build. You count as one size larger when okay, yeah. So you can carry, push, drag, or lift much more than someone typical of your size. You are deceptively strong in that way, and relentless endurance. Ooh, nice. When you reduce to 0 hit points, you can drop to 1 hit point instead. This is nice. Orc lifespan, good question. 80 years on average. It's just humanoid. And let me just check here. Now, Orc was not a playable race in 5th edition. Half orcs rarely lived longer than 75 years. So this is in range with the half orcs in 5th edition. Original 5th edition. Tieflings, born in the lower planes, linked by blood to a devil, demon, or Yugoloth to another fiend. This is better or worse, their legacy, which comes in pumps of power, yet has no effect on their moral outlook. Interesting. So tieflings definitively have their own morality, regardless of their progenitors. They are not evil by default, which again I think it's been traditionally, but that's fine. I agree. 80 years on average for an orc seems long. I would cut that down a bit. I would make that shorter. At the very least, I'd mention here somewhere, but orcs rarely live that long, kind of thing. But yeah, that seems long for an orc, 80 years. Tieflings choose whether to embrace or lament their fiendish legacy. They can be abyssal. The abyss, howling chaos, pandemonium, vats, despair, carceri. Horns, fur, tusks, black blood, and peculiar odors. Chthonic. Which is interesting because that's obviously Cthulhu, but they're more focusing on the demonic aspects of that. And then infernal, Gehenna, also the raging battle is Acheron, the battle. And again, so to me, I have difficulty reading this and understanding what it means for my character. The infernal fiendish legacy binds tieflings by blood, not only to Gehenna, okay, which Gehenna means greed, so you're greedy. Okay. But also the raging battlefields of Acheron and the diabolical 9 hells. So what does that do to my character? Am I a fighter, or am I twisted, and do I trick people because I'm diabolical? Am I greedy? There just seems like a lot of a very disparate set of stuff for being infernal. And I have horns, spines, tails, golden eyes, faint sulfur. Okay. This is fine, but again, I don't understand why being infernal would give me horns here, and abyssal would give me horns, but chthonic would not. It seems odd. Seems kind of odd. Just a weird variety of options to choose from there. Tiefling can be medium or small, which I think this fits more because, again, you think of the traditional sort of demonic creature, and obviously tieflings are not literally demonic or devilish, but you think of the typical summoned creature in a thing, and it could be big or it could be small. It could be little thing running around. You think of the creatures in Doom. You certainly have smaller creatures, so this is fine. You have really big creatures too, but we have not seen a large creature, and that will probably continue on. In fact, we know it's going to continue on because this is our last race. Dark Vision, Fiendish Legacy. So again, you can be Abyssal, Chthonic, or Infernal, and you get various spells for that. Plus an otherworldly treasure, presence of fellow characters. Okay. See, this is good. This I really like. This Tieflings of Many Worlds. This is what I want to. This is what I want to read. Excuse me. Tieflings born in the lower planes often migrate to other planes of existence and never look back. Their descendants are scattered across many worlds and are especially prevalent in Sigil, the Tor-shaped city at the center of the multiverse. In other words, Tieflings have migrated. They have left the lower planes and moved out, and they have been scattered across many worlds. I don't think saying they're in Sigil is helpful because everything's in Sigil. That's literally what Sigil is. It is everything all at once. But okay. I guess the point there being that if you want to meet other Tieflings, they are scattered across many worlds. So you're not going to see a lot of them. Scattering suggests spreading out. So again, I like that. It says that it's not like humans. It's not like even Dragonborn. It's like other races. They're just kind of spread out, bits and pieces here and there. But if you want to meet one, if you want to meet especially like communities of Tieflings, you're more likely you have to go to Sigil. Sigil is the best place to go. Cool. The earliest Tieflings joined ranks with non-Tieflings to repel fiendish incursions on many worlds, earning the trust of those who might otherwise have mistaken them for fiends. Thanks to the victories and sacrifices of these legends, Tieflings throughout the multiverse enjoy widespread acceptance. So here's this interesting backstory, that when fiends invade the world, tieflings, or when they did in the past, the tieflings were first line of defense for them. They leapt to deal with that, and that earned them a lot of respect. So people remember tieflings as being the ones who fought back the demons, millennia ago, and there are legends of this. So this gives tieflings that duality, where they are rare, and thus less likely to be kind of immediately trusted by people. But that respect, that kind of almost respect in your bones, because you remember that story that your grandmother told you about when demons spread out throughout the multiverse, where the tieflings were there. That's cool. And again, that gives you a lot of role-playing options. That allows you to, when the chips are down, that allows you to stand on a table and as a tiefling and say, just like my ancestors, when they beat back the hordes of hell, I will beat back, the gnomes invading your village, or what have you. That's really cool. And I agree, Lord Admiral, this sounds very Dante-esque. This sounds like they're going a little more kind of classical with the tieflings. They want to kind of bind them more specifically to the various demonic and devilish areas. So that's definitely a route to take, which I don't dislike it. Character backgrounds. So again, this is one of the big things they're moving in here. So, collection of characteristics, blah, 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 blah. You have three options. You can build one, select a pre-made background from the sample background section, or select one and then customize it. This is kind of weird. I won't lie. Consider these choices. How do they influence your current worldview? Do you embrace or reject your background? Do you form any relationships? These are three excellent questions. Straight up about backgrounds. How does your background influence your current worldview? If you were a sailor for 10 years, how did that influence you? Are you more multicultural now? Are you skittish about new things because, the sea is dangerous and dark and it taught you to be scared? Do you embrace or reject your background? Are you proud of being a soldier or are you not? Those are two very useful takes on that. And did you form any relationships during your background? Again, this is great. You were a soldier, and so you bled next to, Corporal Matthew, and you were blood brothers, while you were a soldier. That's a connection. Now Matthew is a monk in a nearby monastery or whatever, right? This is great stuff. I wish this were a stronger element of it. I wish this was almost like write a paragraph on each of these. And then you have build your background. I like the fact that they talk about basically how to build a background. Like, here's how a background is built. You increase ability score, one ability score by 2 and another by 1. Or increase 3 by 1 each. Choose 2 skills for proficiency, choose 1 tool, choose a language. Here's my difficulty with this. I would much rather they start with backgrounds. Here's a list of backgrounds. Here's some choices. And then we say, okay, now, if you don't like any of those, build a background. Or customize a background. Again, it's kind of weird to me to start with all of this, here's how to build and assemble things, because especially as a new player, if I looked at this, I'd feel overwhelmed. Okay, I gotta choose ability score. What is an ability score? I forget what an ability score is. Skills, where are the skills? Again, this is just a lot for a new player to read through, as opposed to saying, okay, choose from Acolyte, all these other backgrounds as a first choice. And if you get to the end of that list and you're like, none of that really works, oh, here's how I can build one myself. Cool. I would reorient that. But to be clear, I really, really support this idea of here's how to make it. We're just going to be upfront. Here are the rules for building a background. Just build one out yourself. Again, or modify it. This is kind of cool too, or at least a useful clarification. Characters can receive ability score increases from several different sources, like races or like Tasha's and much of the multiverse. If you make a character using one of those old sources and get ability score increases from those, they do not get ability scores from background. So explicitly calling out, if you're building a character that already has these things, you don't get a double dip. Thank you. Sample backgrounds, Acolyte. So here's where ability scores are now split out. So before, classically, ability score increases are part of your race. Now they are part of your background. I think this is logical. I think this is reasonable. Spending time as an acolyte learning things increases your wisdom and intelligence. Sure. Especially because your background is would be naturally more about building skills than your race is. The fact that you were born an elf doesn't necessarily say much about your wisdom, strength, whatever, as much as the environment in which you grew up and were able to use your body or your mind. This does, I think, work. I think, honestly, you can get into similar kind of arguments here about, well, okay, why does being... There's an example here. Where I was kind of interesting. Why does being a hermit give you extra wisdom and constitution? Like, why does being away from people make you smart? I understand the archetype they're going for here. The hermit out in the middle of nowhere. The monk who's got a lot of time to meditate. But realistically, hermits can go crazy. Plenty of crazy hermits out there. And so again, it's kind of this interesting thing where, okay, yes, we're saying that being a half-orc doesn't necessarily make you strong, but now we're saying that these professions necessarily give you these bonuses. That seems similarly reductivist to me. Now, obviously, racial reductivism is a very different problem than professional reductivism. So I'm not counting that out. I'm not saying that this is clearly the same thing. But I just find it interesting that they decided to make this part of your background. I'll put it this way: I would not be surprised if this causes controversy. That if splitting them out into profession doesn't create other debates about, well, but nobles shouldn't be charismatic, right? So we will see. But again, I think from a game design perspective of trying to map our idea of fantasy characters onto game mechanics, this is an effective way of doing that. I think this does track with what we intuitively imagine, being a farmer would give you a lot of constitution and maybe some wisdom. Wisdom is a little weird. I guess the implication that, you understand the seasons. I don't know. I probably would have gone strength for this because, but whatever. So you have all of these things. Let's look at one of them. Let's go with let's go with artisan. Extra intelligence and a little charisma, skill proficiencies, investigation, persuasion, proficiency with artisan's tools, language gnomish. Now this is where I think this is probably the thing that I really, really find fascinating about this, and that I think is going to be one of the most profound changes, at least in this document. This to me seems like the most profound change in this document. Every background teaches you a language. Artisans learn Gnomish. Another good one here. Cultists learn Abyssal because of all of those, spells and all that stuff. They learn Abyssal. What does that tell us? It tells us that cultic spells are in Abyssal. So if we come across a parchment written in Abyssal, we now can intuit what that thing is, just from the player's handbook. Something that really leapt out at me, see if I can find it here, what was it? I think it was Sage. Sages learn Elvish. So, this tells us that histories, Other books of lore are primarily written in Elvish. Now, again, you might say, well, yeah, elves are long-lived, that kind of makes sense. But what does this tell us about Elvish society? Elvish society is interested in history. Elves write a lot of history books and a lot of just kind of general, books on knowledge. If you're a sage, you kind of gotta learn Elvish because of how so many books on this are written in Elvish. So again, this is informing a lot about the world. If you go to a library, you probably are going to need to learn Elvish to read a lot of those books. That's interesting. That really informs your world. Sailors know Primordial because they're out there with storms. Again, what does that say about Primordial? Soldiers, again, this is fascinating. Soldiers learn Goblin because you wage war by studying the strategies of goblinoid generals. Holy smokes. So goblins and goblinoids are really good at warfare. They're not just out there random goblins running. Obviously, you're going to find plenty of random goblins and so forth. But wow, people in these worlds respect goblinoid war strategies. So much so that your typical soldier can read and write Goblin and are reading Goblin war treatises. That's fascinating. And again, I really like that this is implying lots of things about the game world. And it does it in a part of the character that is often kind of a throwaway. Okay, I know these 3 languages, whatever. By tying it to your background, it tells you about what you did in that time in that background. Again, if you're a soldier, you spent time studying goblin tactics. Wow, okay. So when we come across a bunch of goblins, especially some hobgoblins, we're going to expect something out of them. That's awesome. And of course, you get a bunch of stuff. So let's get I think it fits on a page. We have Sage. Ability score increases, skill proficiencies, supplies, language, a feat, fine, and then a description. You spent your formative years traveling between manors and monasteries, performing odd jobs and services in exchange for access to the libraries. And again, here's some interesting world details. Libraries are not free, in general. At least the good ones. The ones with the really interesting, the really useful, the good stuff. They expect you to do some odd jobs and services in exchange for access. You while away many a long evening with your nose buried in books and scrolls, learning the lore of the multiverse, even the rudiments of magic, and your mind only yearns for more. Love this stuff. Because again, this does not limit your game world. It doesn't say your character has to be a master of goblin tactics if they're a soldier. It just means this is a thing that you're familiar with, and you can draw on if you want to. Love that. Oh, and equipment. You have history book, calligraphy supplies, parchment, quarterstaff robe, 8 gold. I like the history book here too. It's the idea that you have a book of history that you can rely on. You can flip through that and say, oh, we come across this old ruined castle, by this fork in the river. I actually have a little thing on here about the battle of the castle at the fork. And we can, read about it. That, I can tell you some information about that. Interesting. Let's see if there's some other interesting set. Urchins have Bedroll Common Clothes gaming set. Okay, nothing too cool there. Sailors have Dagger Fishing Tackle. Clothes Silk Rope. Okay. And then starting language. Your character begins playing knowing at least 3 languages. Common, a language provided by the background, and a language you choose from the standard languages table below. Yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense. Common, that kind of background language, and you get to choose one language because, again, you may be playing in a game where where knowing Abyssal is really important. Or you're playing a supernatural investigator, so you really need to know this language or another language. Cool. You can choose that as your extra language from the standard languages list. So again, if you need to know gnomish and it's not part of your background, you can add that as part of there. And then typical users of those language. Interesting that common sign language is now an option, and that anyone typically will know that, or that anyone can know that. Note that that is not common. There was a thing up here which I found quite notable, that urchins know common sign language, as do other kind of traditional thief style backgrounds. So sign language is a separate language that you can learn and use in the game, and I think that's really cool. And as well as thieves can't, which is awesome. And then you have feats. Let's look at that. Feats. Here's a selection of first level feats. Each feat has a level. Your level must equal or exceed that feat's level. So it's basically, what is the minimum player character level you need to be able to take this feat? And a prerequisite, prerequisites to be able to take it, and then repeatable. Can you do it? Can you take this feat more than once? So not can you use it more than once, but can you, take this feat, say 3 times, have 3 kind of stacks of this feat. Let's see if we can see an example of that. Crafter, any repeatable feats? I'm not quite clear what repeatable would mean. Okay, Magic Initiate. Okay. So one of the things in this new edition is that they've split out the spell list. That's really interesting. And so basically, you can learn arcane spells, but then if you want to initiate into divine spells, that's a different process, new feat. You take that feat to be able to do that. Skilled. And okay, similar kind of thing, where you can take the skilled feat, which gives you proficiency in 3 more skills, 3 extra skills. And you can do that multiple times. So if you want to be skilled in like every skill in the skill list, you can just take that feat like 3 or 4 times. Fair enough. And then you have things like Tavern Brawler, which gives you various basically actions and features. Tough. Hit point maximum increases by amount equal to twice your character level when you gain this feat. That could be handy. I mean, at level 10, that's an extra 20 hit points. So yeah, that's significant, like not massive, but useful. All right, and then rules glossary. So basically, here are the things that are different rule-wise in this new version so far. Arcane spells. Arcane spells draw on the ambient magic of the multiverse. Bards, sorcerer, warlocks, and wizards harness this magic, and as do artificers. Not sure why they phrase it that way, but okay. And they have a partial list of this. So again, this is this thing where they've just divided the spell list into basically all the spells in the game into 3 subcategories. These are not the schools of magic. These are 3 kind of categories: arcane spells, and the other 2, divine and whatever. And I think this is going to kind of simplify things. You can say, okay, if you're a sorcerer, you're going to use the arcane list. If you're a warlock, you're also going to use the arcane list, but you'll access them differently. I like that because, again, it kind of simplifies the game. It means if I play a bard and decide to play a warlock, I'm not switching to a similar but somewhat different list of spells. Right? Where it's like, okay, it's 80% the same, but oh yeah, there's these kind of... No. You're using the arcane spell list. Cool. But again, you're doing them differently. You have access to them differently. You refresh differently. I think that's going to make sense. It's a nice simplification. Artisan's tools, again, a tool set. Creature type. Every creature in D&D has a special tag in the rules. Most player characters are the humanoid type. So if you are a fiend, you have the fiend type. If you're a giant, you have the giant type. Humanoid have the humanoid type. That makes sense. This is a thing that was general in D&D 5th, but I believe was not consistent. They're like, okay, now everything has a type. Boom. D20 test. Okay. Here's the big new change. Mechanically. D20 test encompasses the 3 main D20 rolls of the game: ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. Oops. So if you're doing an ability check, an attack roll, or a saving throw, you're doing a D20 test. And they will all work the same. The DM decides it. Thank you. Must have a target number no less than 5 and no greater than 30. So, if the odds are incredibly low, just don't do a test. It just doesn't happen. If it's greater than 30, just don't. It just, boom, I'm sorry. If it's less than 5, then it happens. And then if you roll a 1, automatically fails regardless of modifiers. If you roll a 20, automatic success regardless of any modifiers to the roll. To which I said, wait, what about skill rolls? Then I realized there don't appear to be any skill rolls in this edition of the game. You cannot make a stealth roll in 1D&D. I think instead what you're going to do is you're going to make a charisma roll, and if you are proficient in stealth, you add your proficiency bonus. So that's interesting. A player character also gains inspiration when rolling a 20 thanks to their remarkable success. Finally, inspiration is mechanically added to the game. You don't get inspiration when the DM wants you to. Now, if you get a natural 20, if you get a crit, you gain inspiration that you can now use. This is brilliant. This is really brilliant. I like inspiration. It's just really hard for me to remember to give inspiration. This ensures player characters always have access to inspiration. I can give them inspiration as well, although you can only have you can't have multiple inspirations. But if somebody uses it, I can give it back to them. But this says, here you go. You're going to have inspiration more and more commonly in the game. That's cool. Why did they decide to get rid of skill rolls? I think because skill rolls are so similar to ability rolls. As for a strength check. A athletics check is very similar to a strength check, and it's based on the same numbers. It's just an added bit of math. Now you don't have to do the extra math on skills. Now it's just you have a list of skills, put a dot next to it, and if you want a stealth check, you just add your proficiency bonus to your thing and you roll. Boom. Mechanically, it's going to be basically the same because you're still doing the, a stealth check is based on that ability score and adding the proficiency bonus. So again, mathematically, the numbers will still be the same, but now they're simplifying it. So instead of having a skill roll, you're just doing You're basically just doing an ability check that also includes the skill. So you're adding the skill into an ability check, the more specific ability check. Also, they have the advantage that they wrote the rules this way, so that every time there's a skill check listed out in the game, it also includes the ability score. So you'll notice it always says, make a dexterity, parentheses, stealth check. So all of the existing rules just use that already. You can just do the same thing. You're just kind of switching the emphasis now. Instead of being a stealth check, it's now instead of being a stealth check that's based on dexterity, now a dexterity check that is using stealth, if that makes sense. I'm assuming that. And again, it allows them to say, okay, these are all D20 tests. They all use these same core rules. And we don't have to refer to skill checks as being a separate thing. Let's scroll down. Critical hits. Same thing as before. Divine spells, gaming sets, grapple. Grapple is the same. Pretty much the same. Incapacitated, inspiration, which gives you advantage. Now, new change to advantage, though. You must decide to use advantage before rolling the die. No more, do I want to or not? You must decide to use it before rolling the die. That's interesting. One of the things I liked about advantage is that you could decide afterwards. Say, I'm going to take the advantage. Now you have to pre-decide. Interesting. I'll see how that works out. Again, I liked having the flexibility, but that might be a table rule. It might be a common table rule. And again, you gain inspiration for rolling a 20 on a d20 test. You can also award inspiration, 1 inspiration at a time. To change to grapple, yeah. I'll be honest, I hate grappling. Speed is 0. You have disadvantage on attack rolls against any target other than the grappler. Grappler can carry or drag you, but they're slowed unless you're tiny. While grapple, you make a dexterity strength. And here's why. I find grappling becomes its own little sub-game within D&D. There's just so many different little things of, well, you can attack, but you're disadvantaged on this and all kind of stuff, that it becomes very fiddly very quickly. Dexterity or strength save to escape at the end of each of your turns. Also, when different grapplers are incapacitated. So again, this may be different, but to me, this is similar enough. I'm sure those tweaks are useful, but in my games, the kind of thing where it's like, okay, if you grapple, we'll use these rules, but we're not going to do it. It's not going to come up every 5 minutes. You lose inspiration at the end of a long rest. Long rest experience. Yep. Yeah. Typical long rest stuff. When it's a long rest, you gain all your hit points and up to half of your hit dice. Is that always the case? I thought you got all of your hit dice back. That might be one of those things that I always thought was true, but I just kind of simplified my own brain. Let me see, where are the results? Actually, I can check the index. That's an interesting question. Hit dice. H. Hit points, hit dice. 12? Really? Way back there? Probably should be on a long rest. Well, page 12. Okay, no. Hit points. Yeah, I should check long rest then. All this seems fine. Long rest. This is very fiddly. Long rest. See resting. Resting. 186. I do like this book. I mean, this is definitely a high water mark. The original Player's Handbook of 5th edition. Long rest. Regains. Half hit dice. So it's exactly the same. I did not realize that. Interrupting rest. Musical instrument. Primal spells. Slowed. Tool proficiency. Tremor sense. Unarmed strike. Yeah. Again, I'm sure there are tweaks here. I mean, there must be if they added them to this list, but these all look similar enough to be like, okay, they've tweaked some things, but this doesn't look like a completely different approach to grappling or unarmed strikes and so forth. We have these now 3 main spell lists: Arcane, Divine, and Primal. And so here are your Arcane list, Divine spells, and Primal spells, and that's it. So let me look at skills. Skill proficiencies. Proficiency in the perception skill. Proficiency in the stealth skill. Skill proficiencies. Skill proficiencies. Blah 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 blah. I'm looking to see if there's anywhere where they define how skills are used. Because again, I'm curious if this means that you are just going to make... there we go. If you have proficiency with a tool, you can add your proficiency bonus to any ability check that you make using that uses that tool. If you have proficiency in the skill that's also used with that check, you have advantage on the check too. This functionality means you can benefit from both skill proficiency and tool proficiency on the same ability check. I'm assuming this means separate stuff. I'm assuming this means that... I'm assuming that this is not... That this also in 2 does not mean that 1 is a prerequisite. I assume this means that if you have proficiency in the skill, you have advantage on the skill on the check. So that's interesting. So it is not a bonus anymore. Wait a second. Then why do they call it skill proficiency? Yeah, proficiency in one skill. That's weird. So I take that back. I'm assuming what this means is that if you have tool proficiency, you add your proficiency bonus. But if you also have skill, if you also have skill proficiency, that gives you advantage instead of adding a proficiency bonus. So you get both at once without them stomping on each other. In other words, we're not adding a rule that says in this one case you add your proficiency twice. No. But I'm assuming this does imply, by the fact of calling it skill proficiency, it is just a bonus on an ability check. We'll see. What I think about NPCs and monsters not being able to crit, that is interesting. Weapons and unarmed strikes have a special feature for player characters' critical hits. I assume one of the reasons they're doing this is that they are going to give critical hits to particular monsters. That some monsters will now be able to crit while others cannot. So it's now a special feature of certain monsters. If I were them, I would also modify that to say that, ogres crit on a 15 plus. So you have monsters that can crit, but they can crit much more often than player characters even. So that's how I would kind of take advantage of that, is to give you a lot more options with how crits work. So goblins can't crit. Kobolds can't crit. Fine. Fair enough. That said, that's kind of a shame. I do like the idea that even small creatures can get in a lucky hit that can kind of take you down. On the other hand, I have seen complaints that the game can be very swingy at lower levels, particularly like first level, second level, third level, that you can run across some kobolds that just wipe the party because they roll particularly well. And they happen to roll a couple of really good crits. So this could even out the game in useful ways for some players, in some groups. So again, I'm not against that. I'm surprised. I'm not surprised. I am intrigued by this change. But again, this feels like one of those things where it's like, yeah, I can see it. It also makes the player characters feel more special and feel more unusual. Also, I wonder, so let's go back. Hold on. First edition. Basic rules. Hit points, hit dice. I'm going to see what the crit rules were in first edition, if they existed. I don't recall. Creating characters, spells, character movements, getting traps and counters, dividing XP, movement again, doors, encumbrance. Gotta have encumbrance, how to attack, adjustment to attack rolls. In first edition, crits did not do extra damage. They were simply always a hit. I'm just reading and making sure. So yeah, back in first edition. Now granted, these were attacks for everybody. So everybody could crit, but there was no extra damage from them. Let's just check the AD&D Player's Handbook real quick. See if they changed that at all. As they expanded. I mean, this should be the same game. Combat procedures. first strike, because of course you got to have that. Spell combat, turning undead, magical control. Boy, these rules are weird. Heavy combat. To hit. Combat procedures, saving throws, armor class. First strike, weapon factors, damage, falling damage. I actually don't even see crits in here. Maybe in here, but nothing much. And damage immune on hit points. Falling damage, yeah, there doesn't appear to be any extra thing there. So it's varied in history. Again, I'm not horrified by that. I think that could just level out the game in useful ways. Let me scroll back and see if there's anything else there. And again, this is a playtest. This is a draft. I expect this to be quite different from the original game. And if you look back to the first 5th edition playtest, that was very different than the 5th edition we eventually got. I mean, there are some similar bones, but there's a lot that changed between those two things. So I do not expect this to be... I expect this to be directional, but not like a shape, a clear shape of exactly how things are gonna be there. But yeah, overall, I'm fine. The feats I don't. Go back to those feats. Tough, Tavern Brawler, Skill, Savage Attacker, Magic Initiative. Again, these feel very much like 5th edition feats. But yeah, I think the split into race and background provides a lot more role-playing teeth. There's a lot more meat to sink your teeth into as a role player with those two things, because they differentiate nicely. I think there will be some slightly odd overlap between class and background, which we see what those actually look like, because again, those are going to be kind of similar. You know, fighter, soldier. It can be a little weird to be a fighter with a noble background. Can happen, but I guess not too weird. But yeah, I'd be interested. Well, I guess things like noble with the urchin background, or noble with the hermit background, just seems kind of weird. You can certainly make it work, and that can be some of the most interesting characters. But I can see some of those not meshing kind of obviously, and leading to some weird interactions there. But I do think that those would be that's a nice trifecta of class, race, and background. And then again, I love that idea of you learn a language in your background which tells you something about what it's like being as part of that background, and some stuff about the world at large. And of course, NPCs, this does not apply, which is fine. Yeah, I'm intrigued. I'm also intrigued by the fact that this is almost playable. You could basically take this to the table, again, with 5th edition rule set. I think you could take 5e classes and marry them to these races and backgrounds and play it and see what it looks like. I wouldn't mind doing that at some point. People are concerned about microtransactions with the virtual tabletop thing. Wouldn't surprise me at all. That said, I mean, so a couple of thoughts on microtransactions. First off, there's a view in the world that microtransactions are evil, are never worthwhile, and that basically basically all computer games should be like a $60 retail thing. And I don't think that's the world we live in, and the world we're moving towards. I don't think that's viable for everything. I don't think that's viable for everything all the time. I think there are games where you know, you throw some money at it in some ways, and it can be done in ways that are reasonable, right? So when people say microtransactions and spit after saying the word, you know, virtually speaking, I'm not that that I don't agree with that quite that much. Granted, microtransactions can be done really, really poorly. Like we've seen bad microtransactions, but I think that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think that is overreaction. I think that's saying because there are bad versions, there should be no versions. I don't agree with that logic. Also, Wizards of the Coast has not been particularly crazy with how they handle monetary aspects. Like in D&D Beyond has been pretty reasonable. And again, D&D Beyond has not been part of Wizards until recently, separate entities. But like you look at the virtual tabletop for 4th edition was going to be, as far as I understand, free. And the virtual tool they had for 4th edition was, as I recall, free. Straight up. You just use that to, and that was that wasn't their VTT system. It was their monster builder and counter builder, all that kind of stuff. That was a great tool, and you just used it. As I recall, there was no charge for that. Could be wrong. So I don't see a history of that within this particular part of Hasbro. Again, it's possible, but there are lots of things that are possible. Other things could happen, but that to me sounds like, I'll be honest, and I'm not calling anyone out because I have literally not seen any videos about this yet. I think jumping on, or I think making a video saying microtransaction could be a problem smells to me of clickbait. That smells to me of looking for a possible problem instead of saying what's truly likely. I think there could absolutely be microtransactions. They could absolutely be done poorly, but I don't think it's a clear and present danger, right? When I think about Ardlings, would I make one? I'll put it this way: I am more likely to make an Ardling than I am to make like an Aarakocra or an angel. Yeah, I forget what they called the angels. It was just angels, angelic beings. I think this version, where they are more, I like that term, supernal beings, where they feel more like DC superheroes, right? You know, like Thor, than they do like a lot of other options out there. That makes it more tractable to me. Where I can see myself creating a character with that background, especially having the animal head. I think that creates a really unique, remarkable character that I can kind of wrap my brain around better than I can being of angelic, nature. I've been watching The Sandman, the new Sandman Netflix show, which I'm loving, and there is a certain demonic character in that is played brilliantly, and I could never play that character at my table. I could never play that character as a DM because demons think differently than we do. Supernatural beings think differently than we do because they are literally on a different plane of existence. And so I always had a difficulty imagining myself playing that kind of a character because your motivations are just so foreign. But I can wrap my brain around because it feels more like a character out of like Greek myth, or Roman myth or whatever, where you're playing, or Egyptian myth, an Anubis type character, where it's like you're different, but you're more grounded in that way, where you have this association with another thing, but there's something to connect to with this one, which I like a lot. Obviously not as immediate as like an elf or a dwarf, but I can imagine it. I can connect to it. I'm wondering what the inspirations are for these, like fantastically, like what fantasy novels and fantasy movies are they drawing on for this? I'll tell you. What was the Gwyn Saga. There is a famous novel series adapted into an anime called Gwyn Saga, where these the story centers on a warrior that has this leopard mask magically affixed to his head, and so he looks like basically a leopard-headed warrior. And I wonder if that's one of the inspirations there. The fierce passions of Arborea, the heroic heart of Isgard. Well, there we go. The wondrous nature of the beastlands called the Ardlings. Heroic champions of the Cataclysmic Plain. So again, that feels kind of like a again, sort of a Roman heroic character. Blissful Harmony of Arcadia, Justice of Celestia, Paradise of Bitopia, Staunch Defenders of the Lawful Good Plains. And again, this is kind of like the tieflings. So I'm like, I don't quite understand all of these different planes that are trying to connect together. But Paragons of Kindness. So that might be more your traditional sort of Guardian of the Forest type. The thing. Well, I mean, who's the wolf-headed boy from Demon Slayer? Wonder if that's also kind of a connection. Obviously, he's literally wearing a head. He's literally wearing it's like a mask he's wearing. But yeah, that connects with you're traveling through a forest and you meet the guardian of the forest, and it's not an elf, it's not a whatever. It's literally this individual who guards the forest, and they are wearing an elk's skull, or they are wearing a bear's skin or whatever. And in this case, you literally have the head of a bear. That is like who you are. But that kind of archetype might be what they're going for there. I can see it. I can definitely see it. You can fly, so again you have kind of the Tengu connection. Have the legacy, which gives you some magic. And resistance to radiant damage. Okay, fine. Okay, here we go. Ardlings bring a little bit of the upper planes wherever they go. In many worlds, they use the magic of their celestial legacies to inspire and heal others. Inspire and heal others. Again, I'm not familiar with the fantastical archetype that we're drawing on, other than like dryads, maybe. By virtue of their legacies, some strive to make the world a better place. Others use their gifts to be the best version of themselves they can be. Others are just delighted to have a connection without the responsibility of always having to do the right thing. So yeah. This honest Ardlings to me feel a bit like, again, sort of fixing that type of player character where folks are like, I don't know how to play an angel, but this gives me more to work with, as opposed to being like, we have a very clear idea of what an Ardling would look like. So they found that middle ground. That's fine. It's kind of surprising it's in the playtest, I'll be honest. This might be one of those things, in fairness, where in the playtest they're like, we have this neat idea, let's throw it in there to see what people think. But we don't, but this isn't necessarily going to be like page 1 of the player's handbook, right? This might be one of those things which is, we're going to get some ideas early on. Actually, here's a good example. We're talking about, why would they do a playtest like this? I think one of the advantages of a playtest is that you can introduce things at different points. Ardling could be one of those things where they're like, we want to drop in this kind of fix and change. We're really unsure what that's going to look like at the final product. We are pretty certain it's going to go through multiple revisions, because even we're not quite sure what it is yet. So we're going to throw it in the first playtest, so we have plenty of time to iterate on it. But like in the final game, it's going to be like an advanced option potentially. Like, we're not committing this to be part of the main game, but we want to get early on figuring this thing out, so it goes in the playtest early. That would be my intimation as to why it's here. Again, you kind of want to get humans right, you want to get dwarves right, you want to get dragonborn right. So that those make a lot more sense. I'm wondering if there are any things here we're missing.
Note, no half-orcs, no half-elves.
And so again, I'm assuming that those rules about children of races are basically doing that. Where it's like, we don't have to give you rules for half-orcs or half-elves. You just use those rules, say, okay, figure out the parent that dominates, figure out your physical characteristics, we're done. You know, we don't have to get into those arguments. Yeah, I can understand that. That does seem like kind of an thing. Dwarf, elf, halfling, human, dragonborn, gnome, human. Yep. No classes, backgrounds. Let's look at backgrounds. Unfortunately, they don't list them all in the table of contents. So we have. I'm curious what they've missed or not. I have not watched the trailer because I'll be honest. Most of those trailers are low on content. Anything interesting I missed? Okay, the backgrounds. We have Acolyte. We have Artisan is not in the player's handbook. Charlatan, player's handbook. Criminal is not in the player's handbook. I'm assuming that is now been changed to Charlatan, maybe? Maybe there's no criminal anymore? Interesting. Cultist is new. Entertainers in the player's handbook. Folk hero, I don't see. Farmer is new. Gladiator is new. Guide is new. Guard is new. Wow. Guild Artisan was in the player's handbook, is not in here. Hermit is in the player's handbook. Laborer is new. Noble's in the player's handbook. Outlander is gone. Pilgrim is new. Sage is in the player's handbook. Sailors in the player's handbook. Soldiers in the player's handbook. Urchins in the player's handbook. So quite a few changes there, actually. Any races use a green screen as a background? Good question. Taylor does show a bit about the new VDT stuff and also a few claims. Fair enough. Yeah, I might check it out at some point. I'll be honest. Again, I'm that's less important to me than actually looking at the book. And again, this seems like a pretty reasonable set of things. I'm also a little surprised that it used the exact same product identity, the exact same like fonts and layout as their existing stuff. So this definitely feels more like a again, like a second edition to first edition kind of a change. This is an expansion cleanup to fifth edition. It's not a mechanically new thing, which again is one of the things that they said. This is not meant. It is meant to be backwards compatible with fifth edition, and so the fact that they're using the same fonts, same layout, definitely implies that they're not trying to differentiate this dramatically from the original stuff. This is a second edition. It's sort of a 5.5, much like 3.5 was. Yeah, I think this is basically 5.5. One D&D. I'm curious if this is also what they're trying to do, basically Windows 10. So Windows 10 was supposed to be the last edition of Windows, where it's just we're going to have this one version, we're going to update forever. Obviously, that wasn't the case. But that might be kind of the intent here, is that they're not going to do dramatic changes to it. They're just going to tweak this rule set over and over and over, over the course of time. As an intent. It's never that simple. We'll see. I'm very glad they're doing this. I will say, I am, and Wizards has been very clear about the fact that, eventually there will be new rules, right? Things change, games evolve, player bases evolve, players want new things, and as a game gets played over and over and over and over and over again, certain elements of that game inevitably become kind of calcified. People find kind of their optimizations. People find ways of exploiting games that you just couldn't have thought of initially. And so eventually there does come a time when it's okay, we need to fix this, change this, clean this, and so forth in a way that's not just errata, with not just tweaking things. But yeah, I mean this. So I'm not at all surprised. Anyone who's like, oh my gosh, why are they doing this? Like, it happens to basically every game. There are new editions of it, especially a game like D&D. If you're a small game, whatever, you can kind of be the same thing because you have fewer mechanics to play with. But a game this massive, this huge, you're going to have, you're going to have changes. And again, Wizards has been very, very clear about that. So that seems fine. And again, this seems like that. This seems like these changes. And honestly, I just don't see much here to freak out about. Like, there's nothing here that jumps out to me like insane. It's different. It may or may not work out at a table, but that's been the truth of everything they've ever released. Where they release things. Heck, this is a heck of a lot better than D&D was back in like 2nd edition, where it's like, hey, here are some new rules. Good luck. Hope they work. They would literally release new rule sets in columns of the magazine. Like, there would be an article in Dragon magazine that would introduce a new subsystem to the game. So this seems like a much better way of doing that. And yeah, and again, the things in here seem like reasonable changes to things. Can I ask what folks are screaming and yelling about? Because again, I have not looked at anyone's reactions to this quite intentionally. Now, granted, I only learned about this today. I've had lots of other things going on. Watching NPCs not quitting. Yeah, and so that's one of those things where, again, I'll put it this way. I can see people not liking the fact that monsters and NPCs can't crit, but I think that's something that's easy to homebrew. That seems like something that they've left open for people to... That's the kind of thing where by making that change does not prevent that homebrew, because nothing else is hanging on that change, right? If you allow NPCs and monsters to crit, that doesn't change other parts of the system. So, again, I agree that might change the game in ways that are unfun. Like I said before, like I'm not I might house rule that in the game to have crits on everything. But I'd like to try it first. I'm intrigued to see how that changes the game. And also, in fairness, like, this is true of lots of other games. Like, there are other role-playing games where only PCs can crit. Or, whatever you call crits. That is a feature of other games that work perfectly well. So it could work. The multiverse, yeah, I hear that, Lord Admiral. I'm similarly uncertain about that choice of kind of opening it out to all these different multiverses and referencing all these multiverses. Because, again, I think that's overwhelming to new players and not very useful to existing players. If I'm an existing player, I'm knowing that things are different on Kryn doesn't really help me much. And if I'm a new player, knowing that might be true on Kryn doesn't help me much because I'm not playing in Kryn, probably. Or Office, or whatever. So, and also in fairness, again, that might be a playtest thing, where they are saying in the playtest, here's our intent for these things, not that in the final book we will present this as being part of a multiverse, but that, for you all playtesting this who kind of know what you're talking about generally, this provides some context for those changes. So I'm open to that being a possibility, that they're not going to be as multiverse focused as that. What I would prefer is if they did what they did in 4th edition, where they have a quote unquote generic D&D world everything is based in, and then there are little sidebars saying, okay, now if you are playing in Forgotten Realms, here are the gods we're referring to, here are the locations we're referring to, this place would be in Candlekeep or whatever. That's my preference, and that way you have, again, kind of a base to start with that you can play in, or you can kind of use as a rough roadmap to things. Yeah, I'm not as negative on multiverses in general. I will say though, D&D is unique in that I think the multiverse is more appropriate to D&D than other things because they literally have multiple canon universes. And not because they decided to, if you will, but because different DMs literally created their own universes and then they worked at the company and released products in those universes. And so it's well, we now have different universes to kind of support. So again, I find it less problematic in D&D than in other franchises. I understand the hesitancy and kind of the multiverses are can be problematic. I think in D&D it's more understandable. So Charmy, I hear what you're saying about what playtests are. D&D playtests are different, and they do have different kinds of playtests. So in 5th edition, for example, and same thing with 4th edition, but in a slightly different format, they had multiple different playtests. So they had essentially 3 different versions of playtests in 5th edition, where they had internal playtests with the developers, where it's okay, we're going to sit down and play this and see how it works. They would also literally contract out, and Wizards has a group of playtesters they pay to play their games, and it's some dozens of people that they bring in and say, okay, try this, try this, try this, try this, and they know those people and they can kind of survey them more efficiently than they can the general public because they kind of know what they're talking about. And then they have public playtests like this, where it's hey, we're going to get this out to the world and get them to play it and give feedback through. The problem with that is that any public playtest like this is naturally chaotic. You get a massive variety of opinions from people who either love everything or hate everything, or are in between. People have really strong opinions about D&D. So you can't base everything off of a public playtest like this. It has to be, it's useful, it's worth doing, and they have found they have been able to make, definitely, almost objectively better improvements to the game through the public playtests. But it's not the same as those internal things. So yeah, playtests in D&D for these public playtests are different than those kind of internal playtests. They're a little more broad and vague because they're not. Wizards knows they're not going to get, direct actionable feedback from every single group that replies to the survey on this or whatever. So it has to be kind of a more vague, hey, give us your thoughts in general, and we'll get some directive ideas on that. So I can see the kind of, is this really a playtest? It is, but it's an RPG playtest. It's a tabletop RPG playtest, a public tabletop RPG playtest for the most popular RPG in the world at the moment. So it looks different than a traditional, what we think of as a normal playtest. See, again, Lord Admiral, I appreciate your perspective in general, but I think in D&D it's not cheap, because it works for D&D. It's not, it's not a marketing ploy. or it wasn't. It didn't start as a marketing ploy. It's literally how the brand is built. It's inherent to the brand, I think, in a way that it's not in other brands. But that's my opinion. Yeah, see, I don't think this is jumping on the bandwagon, because I think, if anything, other franchises are jumping on the multiverse bandwagon that D&D began. Like, I think, the idea of a multiverse is much more original to D&D than it is to the other franchises out there. D&D's been doing this for decades. But again, I agree that foregrounding the multiverse in D&D, I think, is a bold move, a risky move for the game, if they decide to do that. I think it's not as helpful as choosing one like Forgotten Realms, or just, again, coming up with a generic fantasy land that you can do it. Who did it first? I mean, Greece, arguably. Zeus and the gods are arguably a multiverse, because there are different versions of that by different authors. There is no one canon ancient Greek not mythology pantheon, because there are different stories with different characters, and we've kind of stitched them together in the Western world as we've seen different ones, and we've kind of come up with our favorites. But realistically, like, there was no there was no council of official mythology in ancient Greece. But as a literary thing, as a fictional thing, like a formal fictional thing, again, I can't think of a lot of franchises earlier than D&D that did something this directionally. Possibly American comics. I was talking with Tezuka in the manga world back in the 50s and 60s. Like, he was doing sort of a multiverse, because he would have the same characters in different stories. They were like in different timelines, where you reuse characters in multiple different stories. But it wasn't quite the same. It was more like having the same actor in multiple movies, right? As a modern infinite universe, we can do anything. I would argue that's American comics. That's the Marvel DC in the Silver Age, probably. Because, again, the idea of multiple timelines kind of existed in comics vaguely, but I don't think, like, they capitalized on it until, like, the Silver Age and Crisis on Infinite Earths and all that kind of stuff, which is around the time D&D was doing it. So I'm not sure. I couldn't say that was original to one or the other. But yeah, Marvel DC seems to be the first one to really capitalize on it, to your point, in the sense of, we can just rewrite that. That's a different multiverse, or that's a different universe, or it doesn't really matter, all that kind of stuff. See, I think American comics got more interesting in that time outside of superheroes. Right? Like that, because I think that leads to Sandman. I think that leads to independent comics. That leads to people saying, I want to do something different. So, I agree that superheroes became kind of stale at that point, but I also would argue that I don't know how you keep superheroes relevant for 100 years. I think superheroes became, once you hit the 70s and the 80s, I don't see how superheroes stay relevant. In a world of Easy Rider and Apocalypse Now, I think superheroes just become irrelevant. And so I think that's how that dies. I think it coincided with the multiverse. And again, I agree that multiverses were a factor. I completely agree with you that that multiverses made, again, traditional superhero comics basically irrelevant, or were a major factor to that. But I think also just there's only so much you can do with superheroes. Even some of the great stuff of that period, and later on that period, Dark Knight Returns, Kingdom Come, they're still just really good superhero stories. Like, they are exemplars of their franchise, but not really doing a lot that's super new. Dark Knight Rises is certainly a new tone for Batman, but something that was already kind of around in the edges, that was kind of solidified there. So again, I I think we're in a sense we're basically agreed. I'm just not, I'm just not certain that it was the multiverse's fault purely. Right? I think genres. I think they hit a point of stagnation at that point, which the multiverse just very much hurt. You also have the downfall of the American comics economy. The whole rise of comics collecting, and that died, that collapsed, which didn't help either. Which was, I think, what, 80s, early 90s? Yeah, exactly. Westerns. Westerns eventually just kind of died out. We're starting to see that with superhero movies now. People are finding superhero movies a little stale at this point, kind of samey. They still make money, but we're starting to see a dearth of things. That new Rock superhero movie. I saw the trailer for that, and people seem to like the trailer, but I'm like, that looks like every superhero movie trailer I've seen for the past 15 years. There's just nothing new about that trailer. Yeah, and that's fair, Lord. And again, we all have tropes that just kind of get under our skin, so I totally get that. And again, I completely agree that it is, it is arguably the easiest way to create lazy writing, the multiverse. Again, it is possible to do interesting things with it, but I think it is the easiest way to just cop things out. Yeah. I find the downfall of the Western fascinating, by the way. The Western was so dominant for so long. And I say so long. It was arguably like 2 decades. 50s, 60s, basically. But yeah, half of the major successful TV shows during that period were Westerns. I'm being a little facetious, but it was the dominant genre for so long. And not just in TV, movies, novels, all that kind of stuff. I remember back in the 80s going to a bookstore, and the Western section would be huge. Not because Westerns were still popular, but because just so much had been written for so long that there was still this avid fan base, and there was just massive amounts of content to consume. And it essentially died. Again, we have had Westerns since then, but it just kind of surprises me. It's also why I'm suspicious of folks who are like, oh, superheroes are here forever. Superhero movies are going to be, successful and big and popular forever. It's I think the parallel to Westerns are apt. Again, not that we'll never have a superhero movie in the future, but I think you just kind of, I think there is a point for every genre where it falls out of favor. And it's not the new hotness anymore. Western fell when the culture lost living connection to the Old West. Interesting. Possible. I can see that. 100 years or so. I think that tracks. I think that's certainly a significant part of it. Yeah, I don't know. Sci-fi. By the time sci-fi took over, you mean like 80s and 90s? Like, what do you define as the time sci-fi took over? Because I can't think of a period where sci-fi like truly dominated media. Like massively over everything else. Like obviously you had the Star Wars boom. There's lots of other stuff there. But no, you're exactly right. Star Trek. I mean, speaking of westerns. Star Trek had to sell itself by describing itself as how similar it was to a western. Like that's how dominant that was. Yeah, but the thing is, you're absolutely right that like everybody and their brother was making a sci-fi movie after Star Wars. When I think of the '80s, like '80s movies, I think Arnold Schwarzenegger action movies. I think Chuck Norris. I think other things. Although no, I mean there's a lot of sci-fi in that period. 80s and 90s. Yeah. And it's interesting because sci-fi was ever present, but it wasn't really respected. Like there was a lot of it being made, but it was still considered very genre. Right? It wasn't serious. People didn't take it. It didn't get Oscars. It didn't win awards. Sci-fi didn't win awards in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't really till the past 10 years or so, I would argue, that sci-fi became considered kind of potentially highbrow. Arrival, things like that. Yeah. But again, there's certainly crossover, right? Like you had plenty of like you had Arnold did Total Recall. You had I think Stallone did one or two sci-fi movies during the period. So you certainly had crossover even within the action genre to sci-fi. So yeah, definitely not the it was definitely a big deal. Blade Runner, yeah. And Blade Runner is fascinating because that was kind of a slow burn. Like Blade Runner came out and it had this really passionate but relatively small fan base. They just never stopped talking about it, and its influence kept being felt. People kept doing like visual references to Blade Runner and talk about Blade Runner and so forth, and it just kind of seeped its way into culture. Despite being a really remarkable movie at the time, obviously people talked about it at the time, but it was it was kind of like Citizen Kane, actually, like not a massive success when it first came out, but it just kind of built that reputation over time. I've not seen Johnny Mnemonic. I get the feeling that Johnny Mnemonic got a bad rap when it came out. That people thought it was going to be, The Matrix or Blade Runner, when it's really a fun sci-fi action movie. Again, I haven't seen it, but I do feel like that's one of those things that people had too high expectations of when it came out. So I want to check it out at some point. Not everything has to be, the most mind-blowing trip. And I think I read Johnny Mnemonic, the novel, and I think it was more of like an action story. I read a handful of Gibson back in the day, but Gibson kind of blends together for me. I have a difficult time remembering. Was that Neuromancer or was that, Idoru? Like there's just a lot. Okay, I've been going for 2 hours. Thank you guys for being here. This is a lot of fun. I hope this was helpful in terms of getting my thoughts out about this new playtest. I'm very curious to see how this will turn out. We will see. But yeah, it's a little late. I need a drink. Not that kind. That's okay. Thank you all first for being around. And take care. Maybe I'll do this again as more playtests come out. We will see. But yeah, thank you all. Have a great one. Appreciate it. Take care. Have a great night. See you next time. See you around.